Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. I am so excited for this one. We're going to be diving into one of the most mind-blowing, rapid historical transformations the world has literally ever seen. We're talking about the story of Japan and how it morphed from this completely isolated traditional feudal state, the era of samurai warriors, into a massive, industrialized global empire. And the craziest part, they did it in just a few short decades. Let's get right into it, because the sheer scale and speed of this transformation is just absolutely fascinating.
Now, to really grasp this journey, we kind of need to start near the end, December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. From where we sit today, it's really easy to look at that and think, wow, what an incomprehensible mistake. Why on earth would they poke a sleeping giant that was just going to wake up and completely crush them? But as we dig into the historical source material today, we're going to see that this act wasn't just some random fit of madness. No, from Tokyo's point of view, this was the tragic, almost inevitable climax of decades of history.
And that brings us to this central paradox, which I love to call the awakened giant paradox. We've all heard the narrative, right? Japan awakened a sleeping American giant in 1941. But history actually gives us a massive plot twist here. The United States actually forced a sleeping Japanese giant awake nearly 90 years earlier. So to figure out how that happened, we need to rewind the clock and see what Japan actually looked like before the West literally knocked its doors down.
Okay, let's jump way back to the year 1600. Japan had been locked in this brutal civil war for over a century and a half. But the Battle of Sekigahara changed everything. The victorious Tokugawa clan basically took over as shoguns, which were military dictators. And to keep that grip on power, they made a really strategic move. They sidelined the emperor completely. By 1615, there were literal laws saying the emperor could only do things like write poetry, study science, or practice religion. Zero political power. And then the shoguns started looking outward. They were terrified of European colonization and the spread of Christianity, so they did something extreme. They just locked the whole country down.
This policy was called sakoku. For 214 years, Japan was under absolute national isolation. I mean, nobody from the outside could come in, and no Japanese citizen could leave. The only tiny loophole was for a handful of Dutch and Chinese traders, and they were strictly quarantined on an artificial island called Dejima. Now, the shogun actually used those Dutch merchants to secretly keep tabs on the outside world, learning about European wars, checking out their science, but for your everyday Japanese citizen, they were living in a world completely frozen in time, totally cut off from the massive industrial revolution happening everywhere else.
Part 1. The Black Ships. Forcing the door open. So, fast forward to the mid-19th century. The United States is booming, expanding its commercial footprint all over the Pacific. And they realize, hey, these isolated Japanese islands, they are in the perfect spot on the route to Asia. So America decides it's time to force those doors open. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sails right into Tokyo Bay with 4 massive modern warships. The Japanese actually called them black ships because of the thick, dark coal smoke just pouring out of them. And Perry, he uses textbook gunboat diplomacy. He hands over a letter from U.S. President Millard Fillmore demanding open trade and essentially says, open up or we're going to have a serious problem. Knowing they absolutely could not fight modern cannons with traditional swords, the shogunate had no choice. They caved, signing what we now call the unequal treaties.
But here's the thing. That sudden forced opening, it was an absolute disaster for the Japanese public. American ships brought in cholera, and with zero immunity, hundreds of thousands of people died. It was horrific. Plus, the economy just tailspinned into chaos. Cheap foreign goods flooded in, ruining local businesses, and massive inflation made the price of basic stuff like rice skyrocket. And the samurai, they were arguably hit the hardest. These elite warriors hadn't fought a war in 2 centuries, and their pay was literally fixed in rice stipends. Suddenly, they found themselves totally broke, desperate, and incredibly angry at their government.
And that anger, it exploded into a revolution. These powerful southern domains, specifically Satsuma and Choshu, teamed up to overthrow the shogunate. Their big rallying cry was Sono Joy, which translates to revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Basically, they felt the shogun completely sold them out, so they started the Boshin War to put the young, 15-year-old Emperor Meiji back in charge. Their whole plan was to kick the foreigners out and just go back to the good old days of isolation. But man, did history have a curveball for them.
Part 2. The Radical Meiji Restoration. Copying to survive.
So the rebels win. But as soon as they get into power, they face a really harsh reality check. Expelling the Westerners? Yeah, completely impossible. The West was just too heavily armed. So they pivot. And this is the crucial turning point. To
To survive as an independent country, they decide they have to rapidly copy the West in absolutely every conceivable way. This kicks off the Meiji Restoration, which is honestly one of the most aggressive, top-down modernizations in human history. I mean, Japanese society flipped upside down practically overnight. The young Emperor Meiji chopped off his traditional top knot, grew a very European-looking beard, and started wearing Western military uniforms. In 1872, he even made a huge public spectacle of eating meat, shattering a centuries-old Buddhist taboo against it. And the public? Millions of citizens just followed his lead. Out with the kimonos and swords, in with the tailored suits and modern firearms.
Actually, here's a fun little historical side note for you. The Japanese got so obsessed with Western culture that they started craving Western drinks too, especially beer. European and American-style breweries started popping up everywhere. In fact, Asahi Beer was founded in Tokyo in 1889 just to meet this insane new demand. And here's the crazy part. Today, that very same Japanese company actually owns the iconic Czech beer brand, Pilsner Urquell. It just goes to show you how deeply interconnected this whole era of rapid globalization really was.
But, as you might expect, tearing up centuries of tradition overnight comes with a really tragic human cost. The samurai, the very guys who fought to put the emperor back in power, suddenly found their whole way of life outlawed. They couldn't carry their katanas anymore, their stipends were cut off. It was brutal. By 1877, all that resentment boiled over into the Satsuma Rebellion, led by a guy named Takamori Saigo. It was this heartbreaking clash of eras. A brand new, Western-trained army made up of just everyday peasants ended up completely crushing the last traditional samurai. The whole thing ended with Saigo committing ritual suicide, and that literally closed the book on the samurai era forever.
With the internal rebellion out of the way, the Meiji government put all its energy into one thing: building a lethal, modern military. And they did it by literally headhunting the best experts on the planet. First, they brought in French advisors. But when France lost the Franco-Prussian War, Japan smartly pivoted right over to the winners. They brought in Prussian experts, working under the legendary Helmuth von Moltke, to structure their army's general staff, while using the British as a template for a world-class navy. They weren't just modernizing, they were systematically engineering an absolute state-of-the-art war machine.
Part 3. The Cycle of Humiliation, a Thirst for Respect and Resources.
Okay, so Japan has successfully industrialized, right? But they run into a massive geographic problem. Their islands are notoriously poor in natural resources. Having learned the brutal rules of Western imperialism, Japan's leaders figured out pretty quickly that to feed their booming population and run their new factories, they needed an empire of their own. But when they stepped onto the global stage, they basically got slapped in the face with a bitter cycle of humiliation. The first big blow hits in 1895. Japan crushes the Chinese military in the Sino-Japanese War. They win control of Taiwan and the super-strategic Liaodong Peninsula. But literally days later, Russia, France, and Germany gang up and force Tokyo to give the peninsula back, saying Japan is being too aggressive. Tokyo is outgunned, so they back down. But the absolute kicker? Just 3 years later, Russia hypocritically swoops in and takes that exact same territory for itself to build a naval base at Port Arthur. Tokyo was absolutely furious.
So Japan spends the next decade pouring every single resource they have into preparing for revenge. In 1904, they go to war with the massive Russian Empire. The whole world thought Russia would easily swat down this smaller Asian nation. But instead, Japan delivers an absolute masterclass in modern warfare. The climax is the Battle of Tsushima. The Japanese Navy completely annihilates the Russian Baltic Fleet. I mean, it was a massive shock to the global order. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation decisively defeated a major European power.
So they won, right? Well, not exactly. Japan won the war, but they kind of lost the peace. U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt stepped in to broker the peace treaty. Now, Japan did get some territories, like half of Sakhalin Island and Port Arthur, but the U.S. flat out denied Tokyo any financial reparations from Russia. Washington was starting to get nervous about Japan's rising power and wanted to keep them in check. For Japan, a country that had nearly bankrupted itself to fight this war, this felt like massive disrespect. Once again, it was like the West was just refusing to treat them as an actual equal.
And this all leads up to what they saw as the ultimate insult. Following World War I, the global powers met to prevent an arms race at the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty. They set mathematical limits on how many ships countries could build, but it wasn't equal. They established this 5-5-3 ratio.
meaning for every 5 capital ships the US and Britain got to build, Japan was only allowed 3. For Japanese diplomats and military leaders, this was just the final nail in the coffin. It proved to them that no matter how much they modernized or how many wars they won, the Western powers are perpetually going to keep them boxed in as a second-tier, subordinate nation.
Part 4. The Path to War. Collision Course.
So think about what we've got here. Decades of feeling slighted, combined with a very real, desperate starvation of raw materials for their industries, it created an incredibly toxic environment. The Japanese government heavily overhauled its education system, basically teaching generations of kids that their emperor was a living god, that they were racially superior to their neighbors, and that the Western powers were actively trying to strangle their country to death. This state-sponsored hyper-nationalism put everything on a massive collision course. Let's look at how the final dominoes actually fell. Driven by that insatiable need for resources, Japan invaded Manchuria and then mainland China. The US was horrified by this aggression, so they slapped these incredibly harsh economic and oil sanctions on Japan. To survive without American oil, Tokyo knew they had to take the resource-rich Dutch East Indies, which is modern-day Indonesia. But to pull that off without the US interfering, they had to temporarily wipe out the US Pacific Fleet. And that cold, calculated, desperate logic is exactly what led them directly to the preemptive strike on Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Which leaves us with this really lingering, profound question. When we zoom out and look at this unbroken 90-year chain of cause and effect, from a peaceful, isolated society forced open at gunpoint, through the sheer whiplash of extreme modernization, desperate resource hunting, and repeated diplomatic humiliations, we really have to ask ourselves, was the tragic clash of 1941 truly unavoidable the very second Commodore Perry's black ships forced Japan's doors open? Think about that for a bit. I really hope this totally reframes how you view this pivotal chapter in global history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the past.